Okay. So, Joshua 23, let's read the first 5 verses. Now it came about after many days, when the Lord had given rest to Israel from all their enemies on every side, and Joshua was old, advanced in years, that Joshua called for all Israel, and for their elders, and for their heads, and for their judges, and for their officers, and said to them, I'm old and advanced in years. And you have seen all that the Lord your God has done to all these nations because of you. For the Lord your God is he who has been fighting for you. See, I have apportioned to you these nations which remain as an inheritance for your tribes, with all the nations which I have cut off, from the Jordan to the great sea, towards the setting of the sun, that is, the Mediterranean. And the Lord your God, he shall thrust them out from before you, and drive them from before you, and you shall possess their land, just as the Lord your God promised you. So, there are years of prosperity. After the distribution of the different tribal areas that we went through the last number of weeks, there's now maybe possibly up to 10 years of, like it says, the Lord had given rest to Israel from its enemies on every side. There was peace. There was prosperity during this time. They didn't have battles during this time. Now, Joshua, of course, is 110 years old at this point. How do we know that? Because if we turn to the next chapter, chapter 24, and look at verse 29, says, and it came about after these things that Joshua the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died, being 110 years old. So there are 2 farewells, in a sense, that Joshua has. The first one is the one we're talking about tonight. It's the farewell, basically, and the admonition, the exhortation to the leaders of Israel.
What does it mean, farewell?
Bye-bye. Farewell. I'm going. I will see you. Then there's a second farewell, which is the 24th chapter, which we'll take next week, which is really to all the people. All right, so we see reference here to he summons the leaders of Israel. So let's go back and remember, well, who are these guys? If you would, turn back to Exodus 18. And let's see where they came from. Exodus 18. I wrote down here verses 13 through 26, but especially I want you to just read verses 21 and 22. Furthermore, you shall select out of all the people able men who fear God, men of truth, those who hate dishonest gain, and you shall place them over them as leaders of thousands and of hundreds and of 50s and of 10s. And let them judge the people at all times, and let it be that every major dispute they will bring to you, but every minor dispute, he's speaking to Moses now, okay, to you, Moses, but every minor dispute they themselves will judge. So it will be easier for you, and they will bear the burden for you. This is actually the advice of Moses' father-in-law, who's telling him, this would be a much wiser way to approach this. And so this becomes the beginning of the leaders of Israel, okay? And they're obviously much like a form of administrative government that is set up there. You can also see it in another place. If you want to go a few chapters to right to Exodus 24, there's another reference to them. And we'll read verse 9. We don't have to read the whole section, but especially in verse 9 of Exodus 24. Then Moses went up with Aaron and Nadab and Abihu and 70 of the elders of Israel. So we see this established group. Now, this is probably a generation after these guys, okay? These are different leaders probably in most cases, but still principle of the leaders are there. They're the administrative part of Israel that's going on. So he calls a summit, a farewell gathering in which he speaks to these leaders. And he has some very distinct purposes in what he wants to communicate to them in this summit. Now, interestingly enough,
You're not talking about Joshua.
I'm talking about Joshua called it, yes. He calls the summit not to laud his own achievements. This is not the Golden Watch Award at the retirement party. It's very interesting. You know, we tend to have a retirement of someone and we give them all these accolades and we tell them what a great guy or gal they were and everything they did, and we, you know, write down all the this and that and the other. But notice the attitude of Joshua. This is not what he's doing. Okay? Rather, he is concerned about the future of Israel, both physically and spiritually. And he really fits the pattern that we see that continues because he's such a typological character. Look, if you would, keep your hand back here in Joshua in the area, but turn to Philippians 2. Because this concept is carried on into the New Testament. You know, we spent a lot of time in Joshua talking about the typologies in Joshua that carry through into the New Testament. They start here, they end up or are applied in the New Testament and, of course, in terms of the church age itself. In Philippians 2, verses 3 and 4, we see this important admonition by the Apostle Paul. He says, "Do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility of mind, let each of you regard one another as more important than himself." Now, that's an attitude that would end a lot of disputes. Right? Okay. If the attitude would be not what is best for me, but let me consider what is best for you and concern myself for that, then, of course, we would have a lot more cooperation, less conflict in the church. This is the attitude that Joshua has as he approaches these people. This shows, of course, the character of this great Jewish leader. And, of course, as we've said from literally the first chapter we studied, the title of the book is Yeshua, implying
Jesus.
the great Yeshua, Jesus the Messiah. And, of course, we've seen as we've gone through the book, time after time, the examples, the typology that applies to Messiah through all this teaching. Now, this is, interestingly enough, a contrast to the farewell of Moses. Moses didn't say quite the same thing. So I want you to turn to Deuteronomy chapter 31, and let's look at Moses' farewell as he is about ready to have the end of his life, and of course, he's ready to pass the mantle on to Joshua. Okay, at this point, Deuteronomy 31, Moses says a little bit different thing. Look in Deuteronomy 31, starting in verse 27. I'm going to read 27, 28, 29. Here's how Moses addresses the people as he ends his ministry in Israel. He says, "For I know your rebellion and your stubbornness. Behold, while I am still alive with you today, you have been rebellious against the Lord. How much more then will you after my death?" So he's not real positive about the short-term future of Israel at this point. He says, "Assemble to me all the elders of your tribes and your officials, that I may speak these words to their hearing and call the heavens and the earth to witness against them." Verse 29, "For I know that after my death you will act corruptly and turn from the way which I have commanded you, and evil will befall you in the latter days. For you will do that which is evil in the sight of the Lord, provoking him to anger with the work of your hands." So He's clearly saying with the attitude he sees with Israel at this point, I don't think it's going to go real well for you. And of course, in the short-term future, we see historically that's true. But in the long term, we also see how it's true. I'm going to show you that in a minute. So, he sees an attitude of rebellion. He sees an attitude of self-gratification among the people, and therefore predicts they will quickly turn to idolatry soon after his death. Now, Joshua reminds the leaders of all that's been done. Let's go back to Joshua 23 in those first 5 verses. Notice what he says here. He says, verse 3, you've seen all that the Lord our God has done to all these nations because of you. For the Lord your God is he who has been fighting for you. So what Joshua says to them is, you were here when God did his miracles. You experienced the history of what just happened over the last 20 or so years. And therefore he says to them, because of what you've seen, because of the evidence of what has occurred, then you need to add to what God has done with your own actions of faith. Interestingly, he's alluding to what he's going to say and emphasize in the next chapter. And I'm going to show it to you now. We'll go into it further next week, but turn over one chapter to Joshua 24. And look at what Joshua says in verse 15. This is a very famous statement in the book of Joshua. Lots of plaques and things are put on the walls with this statement. So 24:15 he says, and if it's disagreeable in your sight to serve the Lord, choose for yourselves today whom you will serve. This is the idea of what Joshua is saying to the leaders he's gathered in this farewell. He's admonishing them. Make an active choice based on the evidence. That's what he's saying to them. And he says, whether the gods which your father served, which were beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in the land in which you are living, and then he makes this famous statement. He says, but as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Okay? So he's saying, choose. Yeah, it's on the walls there. So this is the statement he's making to those leaders in his farewell to them. In other words, they had options for continued blessings, but they must choose those things to continue in those blessings. Okay? He's going to remind them that they made a contractual agreement with the Lord. We're going to go into that in a minute. It reminds us of what, you don't have to turn here, but I'm going to turn here. It reminds us of what James says, again, as a New Testament application to this principle. In James chapter 2, in verse 14, he says, what use is it, my brethren, if a man says he has faith, but he has no works? Can that faith save him? And then he says, down in verse 17, this famous statement in James, even so faith, if it's by it, even so faith, if it has no works, is dead being by itself. So, what God starts, we must continue. The seed that he plants must be nurtured and grow. And this is what Joshua is saying to Israel. God did all this for you, and now you must choose if you're going to continue it at this point or not. Okay?
Jews both during Moses and during Joshua saw miracles.
Yes, they did. Absolutely. But it's interesting how, and we're going to see this in a minute, how the reaction of the Jews during Moses' day was to very quickly go back into idolatry, but the reaction of the people during Joshua's day, at least for a number of years, 40 or 50, was to be true to the Lord. At least for that generation that saw what God did, they did stay true to the Lord. We'll see that in a second. So let's read in Joshua 23 the next set of verses. We're going to read verses 6 through 13. He says three very interesting things here, and we're going to take them one by one and see if you can pick them out as we read these verses. Be very firm then to keep and do all that is written in the book of the law of Moses, so that you may not turn aside from it to the right hand or to the left, in order that you may not associate with these nations, these which remain among you, or mention the name of their gods, or make anyone swear by them, or serve them, or bow down to them. But you are to cling to the Lord your God, as you have done to this day. For the Lord has driven out great nations from before you, and as for you, no man has stood before you to this day. One of you puts to flight to 1,000, and for the Lord your God is he who fights for you, just as he promised you. So take diligent heed to yourselves to love the Lord your God. For if you ever go back and cling to the rest of the nations, these which remain among you, and intermarry with them, so that you associate with them, and they with you, know for certainty that the Lord your God will not continue to drive these nations out before you, but they shall become a snare and a trap to you, and a whip on your sides, and thorns in your eyes, until you perish from off this good land which the Lord your God has given you. He says three key things here. They're operative phrases. He says, first, cling. Secondly, take diligent heed. And third, urgently secure. Those are the three phrases. So let's look at each one of them. First of all, the word firm is pronounced hazak in Hebrew. It's found there in that verse. It means to strongly grasp something, to be resolute about a thing, or to urgently secure. It's interesting that one of its first uses is found in Genesis 19. So hold your place in Joshua, but go back all the way to Genesis 19. And I find it interesting in Genesis 19 that it is used both as a counter and as an example and a counterexample. Look at verse 16 of Genesis 19. Now remember, what's happened here? God has said to Lot and his family, I'm going to destroy this place. You must get out. And of course, he sent two angels to do this. Verse 16. Well, let's read 15 first. And when morning dawned, the angels urged Lot, saying, take up your wife and your two daughters who are here, lest you be swept away in the punishment of the city. Verse 16. But Lot hesitated. So the men seized his hand. That's the word again. Okay? It's hazak. So the men seized his hand, and the hand of his wife, and the hand of his daughters, for the compassion of the Lord was upon him, and they brought him out and put him outside the city. In other words, who was acting faithfully at that point? The angels. Okay? They literally, hazak, they grasped onto the hands of that family and pulled them out of the town. So, there's the example. But it's also interestingly enough, a counterexample. The counterexample is how Lot failed to listen to the Lord and failed to seize on the moment himself. Do you see that there? It's example and both counterexample at the same time. That's one of the first times the word hazak is used. Now, next we see that Joshua says, he warns them that they need to cling. In other words, it means literally in the Hebrew to be bonded or to be glued to. And what is it saying they need to cling to? Do you see it in those verses in Joshua 23? To God's Word. He says to be glued to the Torah, to the teachings and the truths. And also, he tells them that they're to have absolutely nothing to do with their culture, its traditions, intermarriage, or their religions. Okay? Now, is there any principle in the New Testament about this? Mm-hmm. Turn, if you would, keep your hand in Joshua, but turn, if you would, to the book of Romans. Here, Paul takes the same principle and applies it to the New Testament church. Romans 12, starting in verse 1. He says, I urge you, therefore, brethren, again, urge, it's emphatic, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies, okay, an act of gluing yourself, in a sense, present your bodies as a living and holy sacrifice, acceptable to God, which is your spiritual, some translations say reasonable, service of worship. And then he uses the counterexample, right? He just gave us the statement. Now he's going to give us the counterstatement. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove or demonstrate in yourself, it literally means, what is the will of God is, that which is good and acceptable, and the word there is, the last word, perfect, is the word teleos in Greek. It means complete. So Paul is saying, you've come out of a world, a kingdom, and you moved into another one. What one have we come out of? Yes, the God of this world, right? We've come out of the world run by the God of this world. And because we've accepted Christ as our Savior, we were transferred, it says in Ephesians chapter 1, to the kingdom of His Son. We therefore are no longer members of the previous nation or kingdom, and we're now members of the new one. The idea being, don't go back. Go forward.
Which may do.
And think about how the problem that is seemingly in the church today. What is it that the church so often is taken up with? Material things, goods, money, power, influence, leadership, heads of committees, you go on and on and on, which are all, in that sense, things of this world. Now, they can be used in the kingdom of God, but the focus seems to be lost. The transformation of the person, becoming more and more like our Lord, is our duty. It's the operative command. It would be like your duty mission if you were in the military. This is what you're to do. Okay? Don't keep your eye off the ball. Don't let it go off the goal. And this is exactly...
We are God's military.
Yes, in a very real sense we are. This is exactly what that Joshua was telling the nation at this point at his farewell address to these leaders. So back to Joshua. 23. So let's look at the next word. We've talked about the first one. He says, be firm. We talked about that. We've talked about the second one, and that is to be resolute or urgently secure. And then the third one is that he talks about the fact that we are to cling. Do you see it there? Mm-hmm. It's the word, it's pronounced davak in Hebrew. Davak. And it means that to impinge on something, to adhere to something, to be joined together, or to stick strongly. It has a very interesting first usage in the Bible. Let's look at it. Genesis 2. You remember we've talked many times about the law first mentioned. The first time a word is used in the Bible, it's very significant. It sets a precedent. So go to Genesis 2, verse 24, and Ansh, would you read it? 2:24.
For this reason a man shall leave his father and his mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh.
Davak, that's the word.
Which
so,
one? Join?
Yes.
Join
Cleave. What is there another translation? What does it say? Does it say cleave?
In Russian it says like stick to his wife.
And that is literally davak. Very good translation there. Well, in other translations, what does it say? Does it say the word cleave?
Become one flesh. Be united.
Okay. All right. So this is the principle here, that in the same way that a person is bonded in marriage, okay, the two shall become one, davak. In the same way, Joshua is saying to the elders, this is the attitude and the commitment you need to the Lord, to be bonded in that way. He then reminds them.
I'm sorry, did he mean stick to the Lord?
Yes.
Or stick to the word?
No, this one is to stick to the Lord. To stick to the Lord.
So they had to stick to the word.
Yes.
And to the Lord.
Absolutely. Okay. And think about it. They're different things. I know people that I would tell you stick to the word. That is, they're students of the word or they study it. But from a heart standpoint, I'm not certain they stick to the Lord. There's a different element here. It's both those things. It's both the understanding of the truths of the kingdom of God, and it's also an understanding of your relationship personally with your Lord, sticking to Him. Mm-hmm. Both those things. Okay?
My mom said that there is nothing more important.
That is true.
Than to have personal relations with God.
Yeah. The walk day by day. So you might also look here. Why don't you turn to Psalm 119? David says it another way in Psalm 119. Same word. It's found in verse 31 of Psalm 119. He says, well, we'll start in 30. I have chosen the faithful way. I have placed thine ordinances before me. I cleave to thy testimonies. O Lord, do not put me to shame. Same word, davak. See? It's both cleaving to the word and it's cleaving to the Lord. Now, Joshua points out in these verses about the Lord's power. Remember, read it again, look at it again. He's not talking so much about what they did as a military, even though they were there, But he's talking about the remarkable things that God did. He says, I drove out these powerful nations before you. And literally he's saying, you saw the miracle at Jericho. You saw the miracle in Joshua 10 at the valley of Beth Horon. Quote, the day that the sun stayed in the sky longer and longer for the battle to be completed. He said, you've seen what God's done. You've seen that he put a fright among the peoples. Remember, we went over that many times. He says that I'll send the fear of you like hornets into their land. They'll fear you. And that's why when he said, one of you will scare 1,000, and he repeats that phrase here also in the book of Joshua. Now, he says that God has done this for them, but if they want to continue in that powerful protection, that therefore they must cling to the Lord. Let's look at a few other verses about God's protection, because this is what he's saying to them. He's saying if you want God's favor to continue, then you must cling to the Lord. If you don't cling to him, you're not going to have his favor. Right? Let's turn to a very famous psalm, since we're already there in Psalms. Go to Psalm 91. Let's look at this idea of God as a protection. This may be one of the most famous psalms of all about God the protector. Psalm 91, we'll read verses 1 and 2. It says, he who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will abide in the shadow of the Almighty. I will say to the Lord, my refuge and my fortress, my God in whom I trust. Refuge and fortress. Pretty strong idea of protection, isn't it? Turn over a couple pages to Psalm 94. A similar concept. Psalm 94. And we're going to look at verse 22. But the Lord has been my stronghold, and God the rock of my refuge. The rock of my refuge. There's another interesting way I think that this is put, and if you'll turn a little bit further to your right, go to the prophet Isaiah, a little bit past Psalms there, and go to Isaiah chapter 33. Isaiah 33. We're going to look at verses 15 and 16. Isaiah says, he who walks righteously and speaks with sincerity, he who rejects unjust gain and shakes his hands so that they hold no bribe, he who stops his ears from hearing about bloodshed and shuts his eyes from doing and looking upon evil, in other words, living the law of the Lord in your life, he will dwell on the heights. His refuge shall be an impregnable rock, and his bread, literally sustenance, will be given to him. His water will be sure. Think about that. How long can you live without water?
12, 14 days.
No, less than that, about 3 or 4.
3-4 days.
Yeah, and when dehydration hits, and you're pretty much gone after 3 or 4 days. Now you can make it longer without food, but think about what he's saying here. He's saying that if you live what God asked you to do, that he will be a refuge like an impregnable rock, and he will therefore provide your bread and your water, that which you need to live. Very interesting, though. Now, he also says, back in Joshua, let's turn back to Joshua 23 again. Joshua 23. He then finally says the word take diligent heed. You see it in verse 11? So take diligent heed. This is an interesting word. It's the word mehod. It's actually a phrase. It's in Hebrew the word mehod shamar. Now the word mehod means, it's an adjective, and it means exceedingly or forcefully or powerfully. The word shamar means to guard or protect, and literally it brings the image in the Hebrew of putting a protective wall around something. Now again, interestingly enough, the law first mentioned, I think, is quite interesting again in this context of this word. Let me show you where it's first found. Turn to Genesis 2. And we're going to look at verse 15. Here's the example of its use. I'm just going to read verse 15, Genesis 2.
Then the Lord God took the man and put him into the garden of Eden to cultivate it and keep it.
Okay? To cultivate it and keep it. Okay? He's to guard it. It's his to guard. Now, turn to chapter 3 of Genesis, verse 24. So God gives him this place to guard and take care of. And he's supposed to be diligent about doing it. Genesis 3.
24.
Yeah, read verse 24 now. Here's the counterexample.
So he drove the man out, and at the east of the Garden of Eden he stationed the cherubim and the flaming sword, which turned every direction to guard the way to the tree of life.
Do you see the example and the counterexample? In verse Genesis 2:15, he says, "I give you this place. I surround it with my protection. You diligently take care of it." And then after they sin,
Put in a wall.
put on a wall of protection. Then after they sin, then there's the counterexample. Now I set a hedge around this place to keep you from it. Okay? Interesting. It's the same concept.
Here in Genesis 3:24.
I didn't turn there. Unfortunately, my pages are messed up here,
Oh.
so I can't really go there.
He drove the men out at the east station, the cherubim and the flaming sword, which turns every direction to guard the way.
Yeah, guard.
To guard the way.
Yeah, to guard. So, we see that Israel is told to be exceedingly protective about loving the Lord. For if they don't, their forceful protection that God had given them will vanish. And the nations, it says, interesting, let's look at, see what he says here. He says, for if you ever go back and cling to the rest of the nations, these which remain among you and intermarry with you so that you associate with them and they with you, know that certainty the Lord will, your God will not continue to drive these nations out among you, but they shall be a snare and a trap to you and a whip on your sides and thorns in your eyes. So instead of God guarding them in protection, their enemies will put a hedge around them that will harm them. Example and counterexample again. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
So it's really a vivid image, and it's an interesting play on words using those words, mehod shamar. The enemies, literally, if they go away from the Lord, will put an imprisoning wall around them. Now, let's finish it. Verses 14 through 16. Joshua says, "Now behold, today I'm going the way of all the earth. And you know in all your hearts and in all your souls that not one word of all the good words which the Lord your God spoke concerning you has failed. All have been fulfilled for you. Not one of them has failed. And it shall come about that just as all the good words which the Lord your God spoke to you have come upon you, so the Lord will bring upon you all the threats until he has destroyed you from off this good land which the Lord your God has given you. When you transgress the covenant of the Lord," now keep emphasize that. We're going to talk about the covenant with the Lord your God, which he commanded you, and go and serve other gods and bow down before him, then the anger of the Lord will burn against you, and you shall perish quickly from off the good land which he has given you. So Joshua reminds the leaders again at the end of his ministry on this earth. He lectures them to remain faithful for both positive and negative reasons.
But he literally knew that he was going to die like today.
Very soon, probably within days or weeks. Yes.
But he says, "No, behold, today I'm going the way of," what does he mean by that? The way of all the earth.
It means I'm going to die like everyone else does.
Ah.
The way of the whole earth, the way of mankind. You know, my days are numbered, as we said in Job 14, and it's coming to the last number of them. Okay? Okay. Now, so, first of all, on the positive side, because remember I told you there's positive and negative reasons he gives them. First, he reminds them of all of God's many promises, the positives that he gave Israel, starting literally in Genesis 12 with God's covenant with Abraham, where he promises them the land. Then, of course, we think about the fact that God preserves the small Jewish family in Egypt, 70 people. They grow into a large nation. They end up being in bondage to the Egyptians, but then God miraculously, of course, releases them from Egyptian bondage. We then think about how he leads them as they travel through the wilderness, having different battles at times, and he helps them prevail. They come to the east side of the area, the east of the Jordan. They have two very significant battles there with two kings, Sihon and Og, who, as we said, were big guys, okay, or giant peoples. God miraculously leads them in those battles. They cross over the Jordan, and then they have a 7-year conquest where only in one case they lose. And that's the first battle at Ai. And he says, remember, he said, it's almost like he's saying to them, guys, you were there. You saw it, you experienced it, and you witnessed it. Why do you think this all happened? And he says it's because of what the Lord has done for you. It's the agreement or the covenant that he's had with you. So he's saying God has proved time and time again he is faithful. This is not just some leap of faith where they're supposed to believe in some intangible force in life. They've seen what God has done in their own history. Then he goes into the negatives. And he recites some of the things that are going to happen to them if they don't cling to the Lord. I want to show you a couple of them. Turn first to Leviticus chapter 26. Leviticus 26. and we're going to look at a few verses starting at about 14. This is to Moses is saying this. God saying it through Moses. He says, "But if you do not obey me and do not carry out all my commandments, if instead you reject my statutes and your soul abhors my ordinances so as not to carry out all my commandments and therefore break my covenant with you." Remember, they're a covenant people. Covenants are a contract. They have terms. They have duties of performance. They have stipulations. They have rights, and they have penalties. Do they not? Mm-hmm. Okay? He says, and he's saying here, this is, if you break my covenant, verse 16, then I'll turn and I'll do this to you. I will appoint over you a sudden terror, consumption, which means disease, and a fever shall waste away the eyes and cause the soul to pine away. You shall sow your seed uselessly, for your enemies shall eat it up. In other words, you're not going to have agricultural blessings as a result of this. He says, I'll set my face against you so that you shall be struck down before your enemies, and those who hate you shall rule over you, and you shall flee when one is even pursuing you. If also after these things you do not obey me, then I will punish you 7 times more for your sins. And he goes on and says the consequences are not good if you break my covenant. Now, in a similar way, you can see, turn from Leviticus 26 to Deuteronomy 4. God does a lot to try to forewarn them what will happen if they don't follow him. In Deuteronomy 4, starting in verse 24, he says, "For the Lord your God is a consuming fire." He's a jealous God. When you become the father of children and children's children, and you've remained long in the land and act corruptly and make an idol in the form of anything, and do that which is evil in the sight of the Lord your God, so as to provoke him to anger, he says, I will call heaven and earth to witness against you, that you shall surely perish quickly from the land where you are going over the Jordan to possess it. You shall not live long on it, but you shall be utterly destroyed. And I, the Lord, will scatter you among the peoples, and you shall be left few in number among the nations where you shall be driven. And he goes on and talks about all the consequences. Now, there's another section that I'm not going to go into, but I encourage you to read it for yourself, and that's Deuteronomy 28. It's a very long discussion about what Jewish history will be if they do not cling to the Lord. And interestingly, it says in there, you will become a proverb of and literally what he's saying is you will become talked about by all the nations. In other words, in our own terminology, the development of anti-Semitism. Okay? He says,
joke in a bad way.
Yes. He says, I will take you from your land and I will scatter you all over the earth. Now he's saying this in about 1500 BC. What happens in 70 AD to the Jews? Right, as Titus and his army move into an attack and have a 3-year siege of Jerusalem. It says in Deuteronomy 28, if you don't listen to me, you will eat your own children.
And they did.
What happened to Jerusalem during the siege of the 3 years? They had such terrible famine, they turned to cannibalism, and they literally ate their own babies. I mean, God,
imagine doing that.
it's just inconceivable. But God warns them in such specific ways that if you disobey me, very specific things will happen to you. And if you look at Jewish history, you see that all these things have happened to them.
I think there was a witness of Josephus in that book.
Oh, yes.
Mothers were put before the choice, either I need to eat my own baby or others will eat it.
Yes. Remember, I read from Antiquities, Josephus' history of the Antiquities. I've read in the past sections about that, about Josephus talking about the events that occurred between 66, 67, 70 AD, where eventually this term, the Great Diaspora, occurred. And of course, the Romans then capture the nation and spread them all over the earth. It's exactly what God warned them would occur. So God is saying, if you break my covenant, I will discipline you. Is there any New Testament application of this? Turn, if you would, to the book of Hebrews and go to the 12th chapter. The principle continues in a different way in the New Testament church. Hebrews chapter 12, starting in verse 6. He starts out with a quote from Proverbs. Actually, Proverbs 3:12. He says, "For those whom the Lord loves, he disciplines and scourges every son that he receives." Verse 7. "For it is for discipline that you endure." In other words, continue, grow, move on. He says, God deals with you as with sons. For what son is there whose father does not discipline? But if you are without discipline, of which all have become partakers, then you are illegitimate children and not sons. In other words, then you're not part of my kingdom. Furthermore, he says, we had earthly fathers to discipline us, and hopefully we respected them. Shall we much not rather be subject to the Father of spirits and live? For they disciplined us for a short time as seemed best to them. But God, the Lord, disciplines us for our good. Literally, it means for our best. That we may share his holiness. That's the goal. That we may become more Christ-like. And he says, all discipline for the moment seems not to be joyful, but rather sorrowful. But notice what he says to finish this. Yet to those who have been trained by it, afterwards it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness. So God does not abandon his children. He did not abandon Israel even when he disciplined Israel. He did not abandon Israel even though he let them be scattered all over the world after 70 AD. Because he promised something, didn't he? Even at that discipline, he said, one day you will be regathered and you will become a nation again. And you will operate in the way in which you did as a nation before, the diaspora. And we're coming upon the 70th anniversary of that promise, the fulfillment of that promise. So, May 14th, 1948.
So those Jews who were killed, let's say, in World War II, thousands and millions of them, okay? They were actually, like, paying the price for their ancestors?
Yeah, absolutely. Read, please, Deuteronomy 28 on your own. I'm not going to go through the whole bit. Yeah. Read it and think about the Jews through history. I could spend weeks on just Deuteronomy 20 and show you example after example in Jewish history how that was prophetically fulfilled. It is remarkable. Through the Greeks, through the Babylonian, through the time of Cyrus, and on and on and on, all the way through Rome and how Rome treated the Jews, okay? At any rate, it's very prophetic.
From what Anna just said, what did the Jews think, and what was being taught by 1930 beginning reign of Hitler in Germany?
Well, they thought that they were abandoned of God. That's what they thought. They still had a hope of Zion. Okay, that is, Zionism was still, they wanted a country, and the history of Judaism is very interesting, starting especially in the 12th century A.D., because the history of Judaism starts, the biggest community of Jews in the 12th century A.D. was in Portugal. And then what happened? There were persecutions, and they eventually were kicked out of Portugal. And then they ended up in Spain. This is what we call Sephardic Judaism. And then there were persecutions. And then they're kicked out of Spain. And then they move up north into Germany, into the Western European countries. And then there are persecutions, and they're kicked out of there. And then they move to the east, and they move into Bulgaria, and they move into Romania, and they move into Poland. And then there are persecutions. And finally they move into Russia, okay, in the late 19th century, mid-late 19th century. And then there are pogroms in Russia. And finally, at the end of that point, a large number of them decide to do something very different. They get on a whole bunch of ships, and they come to this place called New York City, Ellis Island, and therefore a very, very, I think the population of Jews in New York City is over 1 million. It may be 1.5. It's a large, and that's the result of those that emigrated primarily from Russia, not just, but primarily from Russia. There's many, many Russian Jews in New York City.
It's interesting to note that on immigration, the Jewish do not have a problem getting into the United States. A lot of people do. But those seeking asylum or otherwise that are Jewish based,
well,
they can get in.
Yeah.
What do you think of that?
I think it's because I think their persecution has always been known, particularly by this country, and has been recognized in this country going back in many years. I think that they were granted political asylum because of that. And I think that of course, we know because of what happened with, quote, the final solution of Hitler and the annihilation of over 6 million of them, that was the impetus for the United Nations based on what had been occurring in the occupation of Britain in, quote, Palestine from 1917 up until World War II. That became the impetus then for, of course, the declaration that what we're going to see here in a few days, the May 14th declaration that they go back and have their own country. What nation has ever been scattered for 1,900 years and ends up back in the very same land that they were scattered 1,900 years prior?
Didn't happen.
There is no other example.
No, didn't happen. So what is your prophecy on that date forthcoming?
Forthcoming?
Yes.
I think that this year marks a very, very interesting era in Judaism. That's my personal opinion.
How much do you think that will be in play with what's happening today?
I think that the next thing that's going to happen that we don't know when, but it will, is there's going to be a very significant war that's going to occur between Israel and Syria and that whole area, and that is, and Iran, and that is prophesied in Psalm 83. It's what we call the Psalm 83 battle. And you can read about the countries that are involved and what happens, okay? And I think that prophetically, we're being, in my opinion, set up for that event occurrence.
Shortly.
Possibly very quickly. We will see. No one wants to talk about Only a fool talks about setting dates in prophecy, okay? But the eras are marked, and I think the era is here. Let me close tonight by turning you to the book of Hosea. All the way over in the, quote, minor prophets, right after Daniel, is the prophet Hosea. And I want you to look at the last chapter of Hosea. And I want to show you, even though God warns them that if they don't remain faithful, that he will discipline them in many, many different ways through history and through the use of other nations, God still maintains his love commitment to them. So let's read. I'll read for you. Hosea 14, 1 through 7. He says, "Return, O Israel, to the Lord your God, for you have stumbled because of your iniquities. Take words with you and return to the Lord. Say to him, take away all iniquity and receive us graciously, that we may present the fruit of our lips. Assyria will not save us. We will not ride on horses, that is, like a cavalry, okay? Nor will we say again, our God, to the work of our hands, that is, idolatry, saying this is a God, the work of our hands. For in thee the orphan finds mercy. I will heal their apostasy. I will love them freely, for my anger is turned away from them. I will be like the dew to Israel. He will blossom like the lily, and he will take root like the cedars of Lebanon. His shoots will sprout, and his beauty will be like the olive tree, and the fragrance like the cedars of Lebanon. Those who live in the shadow will again arise, will again raise grow crops, and they will blossom like the vine. His renown will be like the wine of Lebanon." If you took a picture of Israel in the late 18th century, for instance, when Mark Twain went and visited there, he made a very interesting statement as he spent months in Israel. He said, "I hardly saw a person." He says, "It was desolate. It was desertous." He said, "I went to Jerusalem and there were maybe a few thousand people in it." He went all around that area and said, "I've never seen such a desolate place in my life." Now think about it.
Where he came from.
America. And took a trip.
In America.
Mark Twain was a very famous writer.
I know.
Okay.
He lived in America.
Not certain where his home was.
Missouri area.
Was it?
No,
Okay.
Midwest. Yeah.
Okay.
Missouri?
Missouri,
Yeah.
Latin area. Yeah.
Now think about it.
Redneck heaven.
Yeah, redneck.
I read his books when I was a kid.
Did you?
Yes.
Yeah.
He's also famous commercial.
Is he? Really? Now think about it. Think about his words. Think about pictures that we've even seen of Israel, for instance, during the occupation by the British at the end of World War I. Okay? Take a picture of Israel today. Look at the wineries. Look at the vineyards. They supply something like 80% of the vegetable crop for all of Europe. They have unbelievable irrigation systems. They grow unbelievable crops. They're producers, like it says in Hosea, of fine wine. God says the day will come that he says, I'll put them back in their land and they will be fruitful. And you look at Israel today, and they're back in their land and they're very fruitful.
They're also fruitful in guns, ammunition,
Now, wasn't it also said about
soldiers,
Yes.
second coming?
aircraft.
Yes,
Oh, yeah.
absolutely.
You talk about back when Russians had their Jews annihilated, etc., and Hitler, and you look at the...
Their mantra is never again.
That's right.
Never again. And that's why every Jewish young man and woman that goes in the military, in their initiation, where do they take them? Where do they take them to be initiated? They take them to a special place. It's called Masada. You know Masada?
Yes.
Yes. They take him to the top of Masada, and they remind him of the story of the elite Roman troops that finally came up there, and how 970 Jews killed themselves rather than be captured. And they say to those young Jewish army recruits, never again. But God says never again. They will never leave the land once they're back in it, God says.
I believe that totally.
All right. So I've labored enough. Next week we will finish